All righty, everybody. It is Friday. I don't have the air horn sound effects. It is Friday. Wearing my CS2 Boston shirt. How about those Patriots, everybody? Everybody watched the game last night? Not only were we in Boston for CS2 in April, I was just at Gillette Stadium for the NDIA New England event, and I saw the banner with the 6 Lombardi trophies in the stadium. Very cool. Flew into the Providence airport, saw the Patriots team plane with the 6 Lombardis painted on the tail of the plane. Very proud, very impressive. And then we watched the game last night, and how the turntables have turned. What a metaphor for everyone listening to this stream. Because as we were talking about before we went live, next weekend is the 4-year anniversary of the original 2020 CMMC rule. The rule that started it all for people that hadn't been paying attention to everything that had started before CMMC.
Happy birthday. And hey, we might actually have a rule for its birthday, right?
I mean, this reminds me of when the National Cyber Strategy was going to come out, and it was looking like they were going to publish it on the 20th anniversary of the original National Cyber Strategy, and they missed it by like a week and a half. And I was the only person on earth who cared about the poetry of having it published on 20 years. They probably didn't even know. So hopefully we get the rule prior to the anniversary or right on the anniversary. It's going to be close. And I mean, a week or two in either direction in government time frame, what's a couple weeks among friends when we're all going through rulemaking. But here we are, our weekly CMMC live stream Q&A, backed by popular demand. This is now going to be a regular thing on Friday mornings, now on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So if you're watching the stream on YouTube, if you're watching the stream on LinkedIn, you can put your questions in chat and we will see them. Daniel, how the heck are you?
I'm doing pretty good. It's been an interesting week. I can tell the ecosystem is starting to swell a good bit.
Swell,
tomato.
Yeah.
It's just wild. I'm getting emails like, hey, we've been trying to time this just right, and we've realized we've got to move right now. So it is really interesting to see all these conversations with these thousands of defense contractors I've had. They're finally coming back to the well, and they're like, okay, now it's time to actually do something. So it's kind of interesting.
Hey, and no judgment. We've talked about this before, where it's like, listen, the name of the game is taking risks when you're doing business. And a lot of companies, most companies, the vast majority of companies in the DIB made the decision that they were going to delay as long as possible. And that's a reasonable thing to do from a business perspective, because if you didn't spend the money 2 years ago, you could have spent the money on something else for your business. Right. The problem is, as you have told people over the years, is that this is a very difficult problem to time correctly. And if you end up being late, there's a lot of variables that go into causing you to stay late before you can get compliant. So you end up having to be early if you want to be on time. And that's just not very kind to the budgeting cycle, sort of how you make business decisions, how you decide to take risks, especially when one of the only ways that you can get information about what's going on is some crazy guy with a beard ranting about rulemaking once a week on YouTube, because through the quirkiness of rulemaking, the DoD necessarily can't talk about the details like they did 4 years ago when the original rule came out. So it's a very difficult situation to navigate, but we've been hearing an increasing number of people calling us up saying, hey, we talked 2 years ago. Hey, we talked 3 years ago. Hey, I saw CS2 in Denver, over a year ago, and now we're going to make the decision to go in. Brings up, the way that we want to sort of structure the show, sort of your week in review, my week in review, and then we'll get into some questions. You had a very interesting conversation with an 8A small business defense contractor. And typically what you hear is this is going to crush small businesses. Small businesses can't compete in this environment. And that is not the conversation that you had with this small business.
No, it was incredible to actually hear this mindset from an executive, because most executives, like you were talking about, oh, we can push this down. It's a risk we'll worry about in 2025. We don't have a budget for it this year. And in talking with this business, they're like, okay, how many small businesses are there in the DIB? How many 8A? And they kind of went down this list all the way down to how many with a CMMC certification. And they're like, we're going to be one of the very few that are actually able to pursue this type of work because of our set-asides, and we're going to possess the CMMC certification. It's a no-brainer. I mean, we're going to start printing money, basically, right? With being able to position ourselves in a way where we're one of the very few, if not maybe sometimes the only company that could even be awarded these contracts.
Yeah. It's interesting because they talk about certification as a barrier to entry, but it's a barrier to entry for your competitors.
Yeah.
So if you're able to leverage the obstacle for your own advantage, then it becomes a massive advantage for you. If you're willing to sort of, if anyone's familiar with Ryan Holiday and the modern take on stoicism, right? The obstacle is the way here. Sort of the CMMC barrier is the way towards business growth, because there's just so many people that don't want to deal with it or take the time to deal with it, that if you can figure out how to leverage it as your strategy, then through your like awesome compliance regulatory tai chi, you end up being the one with the cert. And that's, then you're this massive differentiator. We've heard this from some of the C3 PAOs out there, which, by the way, everybody, public service announcement, if you're not ready for your assessment yet, every C3 PAO that we're talking to is booked out until like
April, May. Yeah.
So we talked about this on the podcast about, this new milestone that the 32 CFR rule just went through. If you're waiting for the rule to be published, or if you're waiting for the effective date of the rule, or if you're waiting on something, it's kind of beside the point here in this timeline, because the C3 PAOs are booked until May. So if you're just sort of waiting on something between now and May to get scheduled, then it's going to take you longer than you imagine. But back to this point about certification as a barrier as a business advantage. Some of the C3 PAOs that we talked to are getting calls from federal contractors who don't do DoD work, who want to get certified under CMMC because 800-171 is a federal-wide standard. And they will be the only person in their specific contracting supply chain that has this certification, which they view as a massive advantage. And they're right. So it's very interesting to hear people strategizing around the barrier as an advantage rather than the barrier as just a completely negative thing.
Absolutely. And it's just rare. The mindset has always been, it costs too much. The DoD's never going to do it. Never, this is actually going to be an advantage to us. So it's nice to see those tides turn a little bit. Yeah. And that brings us to sort of my week in review perspective here on this 32 CFR milestone. There might be people who believe that it's an advantage, but it's an advantage in 6 months, not in 2 years, right? And that's totally fair. Rulemaking, I know better than anybody. Rulemaking is a difficult thing to predict because it's a very opaque process and there's a lot that goes into it. However, the 32 CFR CMMC final rule, the one that codifies the CMMC program as DoD policy, the big thing that we've been waiting on since CMMC 2.0 was announced in November of 2021, just passed its final major milestone in the rulemaking process. It left regulatory review with the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, known as OIRA. That is the last step prior to publication in the Federal Register. And at that point, that's it, right? At that point, it'll be published, it'll be in black and white, and that's the final rule. There's some extra red tape that has to happen afterwards. We talked about that in the podcast this week, so be sure to check that out. I'll add a link in chat here in a minute where we talk about the timeline, we talk about the additional red tape, we talk about the Congressional Review Act, we talk about all this other stuff. So if you want some details on what this means, go and check that out. Long story short, we expect the 32 CFR CMMC final rule to be published literally any day. Crazy.
It's the end of the year. It's an election year. So everybody and their brother is trying to get their rules published. So there's a bit of a backlog at the Federal Register. It could take into, last week of September, first week of October, but there's really no way to know because once it gets sent over to the Federal Register, you just have to wait for it to pop out on the other side. So check out the podcast for 32 CFR milestone. You are no longer in a timeline where it's like, well, is it 2 years away? Is it 1 year away? It's like 2 weeks away. So if you're listening to this and you haven't already called Daniel, many people have called Daniel.
Yes.
You're talking about how your inbox is just like, you have like all these flagged emails.
It is crazy. For some reason, the past 24 hours specifically, 6 voicemails and 30 flagged emails. So if you're one of those people I haven't responded to yet, I'm so sorry, but it has gotten crazy over here.
Just let them have an hour. On Fridays.
Yeah.
At first we were like, oh, let's take an hour on Fridays and we'll talk about stuff. And now that the rule's almost done, you're like, I don't know if I have an hour.
True. It's wild, man. It is nuts.
So yeah, definitely check out the link to the podcast for that coming up. One last update that we'll go through and then we'll get into some questions. If you're not familiar, we have a free tool on the Summit 7 website, our Pathfinder tool, because one of the most common questions that we get is, where do I start? And so we put out a lot of content over the years, a lot of roadmaps, a lot of step-by-step processes and guides. This tool will walk you through a series of questions, and it will it'll spit out an output, and it'll say, you should start here. This is what we recommend, blah, blah, blah. And it's free. So you can just check it out. You can answer the questions. It'll give you an idea of the types of things that you should be considering as you embark on this CMMC journey. We have an update to the Pathfinder tool, an MSP grading tool, and it'll ask you a couple of questions about whether you're using a managed service provider, an external IT and security company to help facilitate your compliance with your requirements. It's a couple extra questions, and it'll give you an idea of your posture relating to your MSPs. It's very, very, very common. Probably 90% of DIB contractors are going to need to rely on an outsourced provider to facilitate these requirements, strictly because you just don't have the in-house expertise to be able to navigate the requirements, get ready for the assessment, implement and maintain the technical side of what needs to happen in order to meet the requirements. I mean, there's a very good reason why you don't spend the money inside your business to do it, because it doesn't make business sense. It's way cheaper to outsource it. There's something that we've talked about quite a bit, but that puts a lot of pressure on you to accurately work with an MSP. And there's some questions that you need to ask before you sign a contract, before you jump in the lifeboat with this partner of yours. You need to make sure that they know what the heck they're doing. The number one question on this MSP grading tool, and a question that we have been beating the drum on for a long time, is, do they have a shared responsibility matrix? And you might be asking yourself, what the heck is that?
What is that, Jacob?
What is a shared responsibility matrix?
So,
Go ahead. A shared responsibility matrix is a document that shows which part of your contractual obligations your managed service provider is going to meet and which part you are going to meet. And you actually have a screenshot here to share with everybody of our version.
Yeah, so here's a version that we have available, which talks about the projects we do, the policies and procedures, but most importantly, when you're talking to managed service providers, it's like, what's the MSP going to do or the MSSP going to do, right? And Summit 7 now offers both of these. And so when you look at these things, anyone who's telling you they can do 100% of CMMC is lying, first off, which is why you need a shared responsibility. So take the most common control 3.1.1. It's still your responsibility to identify users. An MSP can't do that for you, right? Yep. We can enforce things so that only authorized people can access, but you still have responsibility in this. And let's say, hey, I'm not going to use an MSP. I'm going to bring it in-house. Well, here's a recommendation for you. Look at a shared responsibility matrix and actually see how much stuff IT and security personnel have to do. And you're probably looking at 2, 3, 4 heads for a small business to be able to execute this successfully. Yeah. So it's a very kind of fine balance there, but really make sure you dig in and look at someone's shared responsibility matrix to make sure they check all the boxes you need them to. And better yet, know when it comes time of assessment, you know your role, they know their role. Yeah, absolutely. And this is, we've had folks speak at CS2 in the past where they had in-house IT resources. They had a team that was responsible for doing this in-house. And they routinely say that it took them a year or longer to get everything up to snuff, right? Yep. And so even if you had the resources in-house, that isn't necessarily a guarantee that it would go faster than using external resources that specialize in it. But one of the most important things you may have noticed when Daniel had his screen up, the most important thing is whether or not they have an SRM. The most important thing about their SRM is that it is mapped to the assessment objectives in NIST Special Publication 800-171A. If their SRM only maps to
the 110 requirements in SP 800-171, it is not sufficiently detailed enough for you to know which parts of the requirements you're responsible for and which parts of the requirements they're responsible for. And it's a very quick way to get trapped when it comes time to assessment, because you're probably paying for something that is not as robust as you think.
I talked to a company this week, as a matter of fact, that had 2 assessments done. And when I brought up 171A, they're like, what's this 320 thing? What's these assessment objectives things? They had gone through 2 paid assessments and they did not assess them to 171A. And they're out $40,000, $50,000. It's just crazy out there. You would think people would listen to the thing you've been preaching for years, Jacob, but
it's definitely. First thing, do they have an SRM? Is the SRM mapped to 171A? This is for government tools and services. This is for private tools and services. This is for technologies, tools, service providers, consultants, whoever. If you are using someone else to do the thing for you, there needs to be an SRM. It needs to be mapped to 171A. Quick aside, this is the origin story of my time at Summit 7 actually comes down to the SRM, because I came to the realization that MSPs are a critical part of this ecosystem back when I was working with small manufacturers, because every small manufacturer I'd go work with, they were like, well, we can't answer that. We pay people for that. And I'm like, who are those people? Like, how do you know what they do? And I had talked to a couple of service provider companies at the time, and Scott Edwards, CEO of Summit 7, was like, we're going to go full blast into this SRM project. Like, we're going to go in at the 171A level. We're going to explain it. We're going to put out content about it. We're going to lead the charge. And so late 2021, I got up on stage and I was like, do you know what 171A is? Have you ever heard of an SRM? And it's been off to the races ever since. The most important thing for you to ask, check out the Pathfinder tool. I'll put the link in chat here in just a second. Let's get to some questions.
All right.
Okay, so our first official YouTube question. We are now streaming on YouTube and on LinkedIn from I Am Around. They said, hello, a few questions per your podcast. This would have been this week's podcast about 32 CFR. Joint surveillance assessments have to be complete when CMMC is effective. What if a joint surveillance is in progress on the CMMC effective date? I'm going to go ahead and say we got to go back and double check the language in the rule to be certain. But if I recall correctly, your JSVA needs to be completed before the effective date of the rule. Now, will they make exceptions? Will this be grandfathered? I don't know. The DoD doesn't talk to anybody about what's going on at this stage of rulemaking because they're not allowed to. But I would not feel confident that if your JSVA is not complete before the effective date, that you will be looped into this group. I'm sure that they know that there are JSVAs that are still ongoing because they don't even know exactly what effective date they will be assigned for the rule. If you're currently working with DIBCAC and you're currently working with this joint surveillance, setup, I would ask. I would get it in writing. I would try to do everything in my power to see if they have an answer, because that could potentially be a big problem. So I would definitely ask that question, because I don't know if there is a distinct answer.
I had one of the rare in-person meetings this week with a company here in town, and they said that they were, with the C3PO trying to get a date locked in for their joint surveillance assessment, and said tentatively it was going to be in January. They have not heard back from DIBCAC on that. My assumption is they're probably not going to schedule stuff early 2025 until they actually understand what effective date they actually have to go to. So just be aware of that. You might have missed the joint surveillance train, which honestly kind of sucks because it's a way lighter assessment than proper CMMC, at least the way we know it now. So yeah. Now
they may put out some guidance and stuff. We'll definitely keep our eyes peeled for that, but I would definitely go ask, because I don't think it's a guarantee. I believe the language in the rule is that it has to be done before the effective date, but I'll double check and we'll try to get to that. All right, let's see here. Let's see. So one of the questions that we had from last week was around how to secure leadership buy-in. And I believe specifically this question came in via DM, because if you guys ever have questions and you don't want it to be up on the screen, this person actually said, I don't want my boss to see me asking this question. So if you ever want us to ask the questions confidentially, you can always DM them to us. So somebody last week via DM said, how would you respond to organizational leadership who believe that the wheels of commerce will not stop. We have a niche product, and the customer will continue working with us until we are CMMC level 2 certified. They can't get what we have anywhere else. We don't have to rush on CMMC implementation. I have some thoughts, but Daniel, I know you have some very specific thoughts directly out of your inbox.
I do. I mean, I have people that it just doesn't, I have people who've been saying that for years. Again, I've talked to thousands of defense contractors, and they're all right now coming back and saying this is the moment to act. And the reason is a few different things. Number one, the prime is doing a good job of making sure what they deem their critical supply chain to be compliant or on the journey to be compliant by a certain deadline. They're checking those boxes. If you haven't heard from them, you're probably not as special as you think you are. And so you have to be proactive and set some internal dates to pursue CMMC. Because I will tell you this, you will be left behind. And listen, you might not think you will be, but if you're like a machine shop, for example, you know, do we need 30,000 machine shops? Can the DoD do the same amount of work with 10,000? And those just grow? I mean, I hate to say it, I love small business, but it's now coming down to CMMC is going to happen. 48 CFR in the proposed state has an estimated timeline of rollout. There's obligations of the prime to sub relationship to be able to see and make sure that they are certified to the equivalent level. It's not going away. The primes will not allow you. They will no longer be allowed to work with you unless you hold the cert.
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? Where it's like one of the changes from CMMC to CMMC 2.0 was the waiver process, right? And so it is a true fact that waivers exist, right?
Yep.
And it is a true fact that this is a big, complicated ecosystem. And so it's not a monolithic rollout. The policy is monolithic, but it's just impossible to know all the iterations and variables and how things will line up and all that other stuff. I don't think that it is a good idea to base your business strategy on the guarantee that you will be able to thread the needle of these very limited exceptions. Because if you're wrong, you're screwed, right?
Yep.
And so you might be in this situation where you are such a niche sole source provider that you don't have to worry about it. But a lot of times we hear that from people who haven't considered the larger picture of variables, and they tend to not quite be as certain as they think they are once we talk to them. So I'm not saying that you can't do that it's impossible for that to be the situation, but you have to be very careful about making that bet, because if it turns out that it's not true, then you're really up a creek at that point.
So go back to the waiver thing for just a second, Jacob, because I don't think people understand this. Waivers are not for specific companies.
Right.
Waivers are for contracts.
Correct.
Very unlikely does the DoD know the full supply chain of a prime that's going after a contract and whether or not this one company makes this really unique part that only they make. Right. So just be aware that you don't get an exemption or a pass at a company level indefinitely. So if you're working on 5 contracts right now or 10, let's say one of them has a waiver, the other 9 will not.
Right.
So
yeah, and
you're not going to be able to run from it.
Yeah, and when it comes to waivers, you know, like we talked about in our January webinar from the proposed rule, only service acquisition executives can approve waivers. There's like 6 of those people in the DoD, and waivers are approved at the program level. So the F-35 cockpit refresh gets exempted from CMMC, right? And that's unlikely to occur because a small business that's sub-tiered down in the supply chain can't comply with the requirement to get certified, because you're expecting that your small business will get a waiver. First of all, if you're subbing to Lockheed has to go to the contracting officer and tell them you need to go to the service acquisition executive, and they need to exempt the entire program from CMMC because this one could that happen? Maybe. Is that in the range of outcomes of possible things to occur? Is that a viable strategy if you're wrong? Right? It's great if you're right, but if you're wrong, it's a big one. And I tend to see small businesses be very risk averse. So I'm usually surprised when I see small businesses sort of zero in on this very risky strategy for securing waivers and things like that. So just be aware of what risk you are taking when you are taking that risk. Alrighty, let's see here. So Michael had a question about VDI. So this comes up somewhat often. So Michael said, great discussion. Thanks, Michael. So I've been struggling with this. DibCAC references me to the contractor risk manage asset scoping guide for systems accessing VDI CUI assets. Consultants are anywhere from out of scope to CRMA assets on these devices. So long story short, you've got this category of assets, contractor risk managed assets, as this carve out as to whether or not they are assets in your scope that are actually storing, processing, handling, dealing with CUI, or just security protection assets, or completely out of scope. You've got this weird gray area in the middle where you have assets that are inside of this boundary, but they don't deal with CUI. So the contractor is managing the risk, even though they could deal with CUI. It's very, very blurry in terms of how the scoping goes. My question, based off what Michael is saying, is what is our general position on VDI? What do we recommend? Because we've had people go through joint surveillance. We've had people be very successful. We have a position on VDI.
We do. So here's what's interesting. I have an email from the DoD CIO in my mailbox that I'll probably actually pull up on this call. But then I also have what's actually been happening during joint surveillance assessments. So I'll actually explain both. So hang on one second. Michael,
I'm going to take your question down so we can see the screen. Great question, by the way. Thanks for asking it, but it's humongous. So I'm going to take that down just so we can get to the screenshot here.
Yeah, let me pull this up real quick. Where are you? Screenshot.
As you're pulling that up, interesting thing about CRMA, contractor risk managed asset. This is a good example of getting enough rope to hang yourself with, because it provides a lot of flexibility in your scoping decisions, but it is very blurry. It is not a step-by-step, categorizes this, categorizes this, categorizes this. Looping in CRMA assets is a thing that if you are confident in how you're doing your scoping, it can be a huge advantage, but be very careful about how you categorize things as any type of asset, because that's going to dictate which questions are asked about which assets during your actual assessment.
So and that's absolutely true. CRMA is a risky asset type. Now, VDI is a lot less risky, but it is definitely still very risky. So this is the email from the DoD CIO's office back, I think this was March of last year, maybe. And I asked the question, hey, is the endpoint itself out of scope? And the DoD CIO came back and said, listen, if you disable all redirection, if you disable screen capture, if it can't, print off of this device, if USB is disabled, all of that's done, then yes, the endpoint would not be in scope. So this is from the DoD CIO, and this is for a long time what we kind of, hung our hat on, right? Until joint surveillance assessment started. And when they started, we got some extra clarity. So depending on who's assessing you, which is crazy to say that, DibCAC, there's a wide variety of people that I have learned at DibCAC that interpret things they don't have like a standard playbook per se. So this is the latest that we have found through joint surveillance assessment. You can still consider the device out of scope. However, you need to have a policy for the endpoint to be up to date, antivirus to be up to date, a written policy, and document the hardware. So in reality, this is basically coming close to telling me they're treating it like a CRMA asset, right? Because they're looking at the asset inventory list. You're having some sort of risk mitigation, which what those written policies are for AV and patch management. Right now, if I were in your shoes, I would probably consider them on the safe side of CRMA and make sure that you have a policy similarly to what's outlined here, so that you can show them that you do have mitigations in place to protect the endpoint at least some kind of basic level.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that question about CRMAs and VDIs, let us know, Michael, if that helps. If not, we can always revisit it as well. We were just in a call earlier today, somebody talking about doing a migration, and this was a team that knew what they were doing. There were actually quite a few people on this call. They were technical. They knew what was going on, And one of the things that I always take away from the calls that I'm able to listen into is the questions that we have for people getting ready for their migrations. And so I didn't know if you wanted to maybe run down the list of some of the things that we typically ask people, because my primary takeaway every time you do this is these are questions that a lot of companies don't know that they need to be asking. And they are questions that a lot of small businesses, average defense contractors, would not be able to do on their own. And maybe as you walk through it, it'll be apparent to people why. That's always my takeaway from it.
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm a big whiteboard guy, just old technical habits die hard, I guess. So let's walk through a few of these key ones, right? So I'm going to use...
You want to share it real quick? I'll pull it up.
Oh, sure. It looks like it jumped off here.
It's a live show, folks. Stick with us. We're gonna do it live.
There we go.
There we go.
All right. So if you're moving from M365 commercial to the M365 Gov Cloud, out of the box, there's a few things you need to know, right? First off, Teams audio and phone system, not part of the Microsoft stack in the sense of them hosting the voice service itself. The licenses are there, but you have to do something called direct routing. So this immediately is different compared to what's available inside of commercial. Other things like Microsoft Copilot, those are not available yet. So kind of more modern SKUs, more modern capabilities, more, newer product releases. You're going to look at about a 6-month delay, give or take, in the Gov Cloud. That used to be like 2 or 3 years. So we're luckily well caught up to this point. But a few things to consider as you kind of go through this is your identity, right? So Intra ID, you're going to migrate that, but part of that migration is single sign-on applications. So during this migration cutover, you need to start coordinating with your line of business applications and the teams that are supporting those to make sure that you're able to cut over, because once this vanity domain moves over to GCC High, we'll use abc.com here. Once it moves over, because that domain can't live in 2 tenants at once, your single sign-on has to change immediately after, right? And so that's a big one. Another big one is Power Platform. So Power Platform is fantastic.
This is Power BI. This is
Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate. Most of the Power Apps and Power Automate, all of those move pretty seamlessly. The one thing that doesn't move seamlessly is Power BI. So especially if you have a Power BI gateway. So that is a big consideration of a step of recreation that you're going to have to do and redeployment from a Power BI gateway perspective. You can do staging and things like that prior to the migration to rebuild this data set, but it is something really, really good to know there. One that people don't think about it much is third-party apps, specifically like the Teams App Store and third-party workflows inside of SharePoint, not native workflows. GCC High specifically has very few, if not any, third-party integrations. Not for lack of Microsoft wanting it, but because these developers and all these other software applications just haven't built the APIs to integrate into the Gov Cloud. So if you're using, let's say, what's a good example? Let's say you're using the Teams App Store and you've got third-party apps and you have tabs inside of your channels or groups. You won't be able to have those for any non-Microsoft product in the Gov Cloud, right? So as you're kind of going through systematically, these are all really important things to know. And the biggest one, and I'll end here, Jacob, is devices. Mm-hmm. So on the devices, there's kind of 2 ways to look at this. On the mobile device side, you have BYOD, which you can easily do and bring across. That's an unenroll and re-enroll activity, maybe takes 3 to 5 minutes, and a user can easily self-service that. However, if you're migrating a corporately owned device enrolled in something like Apple Business Manager, that's a wipe and reload of that iOS device or Android device if you're using Android Work or Enterprise. So again, it's very kind of time intensive to do this, but one of even longer than that is any direct join Windows devices. Mm-hmm. So if it's a hybrid join Windows device, there's actually some really cool stuff that we've been able to build to migrate those seamlessly. However, if it's a direct join Windows device, you have to disjoin and rejoin that device just like you were rejoining it to the domain for the first time. And that could take 30 minutes to an hour and a half to get the user fully set back up into a working state.
Right.
And so you multiply that times 10, 20, 50, 100 users, that's problematic, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, that's kind of where we are. Those are some really good kind of things to start thinking about.
And that's once you're ready to pull the trigger to actually do those cutovers, right? And so
that's right.
We talk about this all the time. People are like, oh, it's so crazy that you tell people it takes 6, 12 months or longer to do one of these projects. And you're like, the technical part of doing the cutover is not the hard part.
No.
The hard part is the organizational friction, the coordination. You have other things going on and you have to do this cutover. And so we were just talking to somebody today and they were like, well, we want to do this migration and cutover on a weekend, right? We want to do it on a Friday, which is perfectly normal. That's the standard time that you do it. There's only so many weekends available and our backlog is growing at a pretty rapid rate at this point. And I mean, it's like the anticipation of the rule is waking people up. And so our weekends are getting booked out now for quite some time. And now people are having to consider, do we want to do a cutover and migration in the middle of a week? Like in the middle of a business week, which, we have a lot of confidence in what we do. We do this a lot. We've been doing this for a long time, but it's a disruptive process. You're changing things. And if you're changing things on a Tuesday versus on a Friday, this is one of the costs that comes with waiting, because now all of a sudden you're like, okay, we know we need to do it. We want to sign up and get our stuff switched over. We know we're going to go with you guys. Here's the plan, blah, blah, blah. We don't have an open weekend until January, which means you're going to have to do this on a Wednesday. And if something happens, then Wednesday issues are more difficult than Friday issues. So it's just something to consider in terms of one of those phantom costs of waiting.
Absolutely. The other piece of that is Microsoft throttles migrations. So if you have a ton of data, we have to wait for all of the data to get moved over there, right? So there's a lot of delays. I mean, we see sometimes migrations taking 2, 3, 4 months, just based on the amount of data Microsoft throttling, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Let's see. All right. I am around the Hall of Fame user. I am around our very first YouTube question, follow-up question here. How many assessors and CCPs do you think will be needed to support the ecosystem once CMMC is fully phased in? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you the off the top of my head answer. And then I will also spend the next week doing some quick maths, trying to come up with a realistic answer. My off the top of my head answer is going to say you're going to need a couple thousand assessors, top to bottom, in order to fully support the ecosystem. And I think that's probably a number that most people would come to. Now, what the exact number needs to be, or the exact range of numbers, I don't know. But I'm going to say you're going to need a couple thousand assessors in order to support the ecosystem. And we don't currently have a couple thousand assessors, which sort of gets into this question of, well, there aren't enough assessors. And there's a couple things to think about when it comes to not enough assessors. One, the DoD can only estimate the number of assessors that it needs based off of what it can estimate will be the number of companies impacted when CMMC is rolling out in its phases. And the DoD can only estimate the number of impacted companies that it directly deals with, because it can't see into the supply chain. It can't tell the primes what to do in terms of subcontracting or not. So from the DoD's perspective, in a very narrow but accurate, it's sort of like formal economics, right? The models don't reflect the real world, but they make sense within the context of the models. You can kind of take them or leave them. Within the sense of what DoD can estimate, they think that they have enough assessors to support the first year of the CMMC assessment ecosystem based off what they have right now. And according to those numbers, it's true. There won't be a big demand for assessors until assessments begin. So you have this chicken and egg problem. Overall, I would say you're going to need a couple thousand, but I will do the math this week. And then next week on Friday, we'll sit down and maybe go into this question in some more detail.
Jacob, as you and I say, I don't know if there's 2,000 companies ready to go through an assessment.
Yep.
I mean, I hate to say that, but like, I know enough of them to know so many of them have waited It's going to be a mad rush, and there will not be enough people no matter what.
This is what this is why I tell people all the time. I'm like, the question of how many assessors there are is not the first question to ask. The question to ask is how many implementers are there?
Yes.
Our backlog is already growing into several weeks before we can get people through to being assessment ready, before they can even kick off to be assessment ready. And if us and all of our closest competitors that specialize in this work were to expand our capacity 4x overnight, there still would not be enough implementation capacity to get people through to run into the assessment constraint, right? The first constraint is, can you get ready for an assessment? And there is not enough implementation capacity because people haven't been implementing their requirements. So when you ask, are there enough assessors? You're implying that there are enough companies ready to go for assessments to run into that constraint. It is true that we need more assessors. It is not the first problem that companies are going to run into, because they won't qualify to be assessed until they're ready to go on their implementations. And most companies in the DIB haven't started yet. So but we will get back to you with some more details on the math. Quick question here. This is one that I don't know. Do you have insight on how and when the lead assessor designation will be implemented? Well, breaking news, everybody. First time heard on this show. The weekly Summit Up podcast is changing slightly. So now every month, the first episode of the month following the Cyber AB Town Hall will now be hosted by Jason and Joy Beeland from Summit 7. And they are going to go into depth on the Keiko topics, the training topics, their takeaways from assessments that they've been sitting through, the certification, the training, all that stuff, which is like its own world of detail. They are going to do deep dives into it once a month following the town hall. So I am around. I would take this question and I would ask it next week on the podcast when Joy and Jason are going to go into detail from the town hall, because Joy will definitely know. I do not know off the top of my head. This is just a good example of there's rulemaking, there's NIST controls, there's scoping and assessment details, there's training, there's policy. There are now like multiple universes of knowledge that you have to have all at once. And I've got a pretty good grasp of a lot of them, but I don't have a full grasp of this one. So definitely ask Joy and Jason next week for sure. Let's see here. Somebody said Friday. What's everybody doing this weekend?
I think that was Wendy. I think that was Wendy.
Was it Wendy? I don't know. It didn't show up. It's a live show. It didn't show up. Wendy, you say Friday. What's everybody doing this weekend? Fun fact, if you're a football fan, tune into the Chargers-Steelers game, because they might as well be broadcasting it in black and white with leather helmets. You've got basically the Steelers are 2-0. They've scored exactly one touchdown.
God.
So it's going to be a massive run game defensive battle. This is going to be old school football. Some of the projections on the scores are like, it's going to be less than 20 points. It's going to be 5-8 or something like that. So it's going to be the opposite of most football games that you've watched recently. So if you guys aren't doing anything on Sunday, definitely check that out. All right, let's see here. I am around again, all time here. What is your opinion of the potential impact of the DoD's treatment of certification requirements beyond exams and possible suspensions of CCPs and CCAs in the interim? Same recommendation. Definitely ask this question during the podcast next week, because Joy and Jason will have a better, more in-depth answer than I do. I think that in the short term, it's going to exacerbate the constraint on not having enough assessors. But like I said, that is a problem, but it isn't necessarily your first problem. Your first problem is getting through to implementation. But this is also one of the reasons why it's so important to get scheduled with a C3PAO, because not only is that queue growing, the implementation queue is growing. And so we're asking this question now about what the impact will be for training changes and certification requirements for assessors. You might not actually be realistically ready for assessment for 8 months, because you got to get through your budget approval. You got to call us. You got to get scheduled. You got to get through the backlog. You got to get through your migration. You got to get through configuration. You've got to get assessment ready. You've got to schedule your assessment. You've got to wait in line to get to your assessment. By the time you actually sit down for your assessment, it might be summer of next year. before that actually happens. So the question of in the interim, what's happening with training is a valid question, but it's not a reason to rationalize delaying your implementation, because by the time you get to, I'll give you an example. This is actually a useful example. I drive from Los Angeles to San Diego on a regular basis. It's about 100 miles down the freeway. And it is fascinating because when you turn on Google Maps, it tries to estimate how long it will take you to drive by gauging traffic all along your route. And so sometimes when I leave my house in LA, it'll be bright red and it'll say, oh my God, it's going to take forever for you to get down there because there's all these constraints. There's accidents, there's craziness, there's traffic, there's backups, there's all this stuff. And it's like, it's going to take you 2.5 hours. But the accident in Oceanside, 55 miles away, will clear up by the time you get down there. And so what often happens is it actually takes way less time to make that drive than what Google can estimate at the given time, because you're so far away from the traffic that you're dealing with that it will be gone by the time you get there. The opposite happens, like if you're trying to drive from San Diego to LA in the mornings, the traffic will be green, right? It'll say, oh, it's only gonna take you an hour. But then as you're racing up the freeway at 5 a.m, rush hour traffic is building at the end of your route. So even though you're not experiencing traffic now, it's getting more backed up at your destination. So we have the LA to San Diego commute system here. The constraint, the traffic jam that you're worried about is at the end of the freeway, 100 miles away. And you're worried about your ETA time that Google Maps is giving you for your assessment. You haven't left your house yet, right? You haven't gotten on to the freeway yet. I don't know. We'll have to work on this metaphor, but maybe I'll film a video. It sort of shows this traffic phenomenon. You're worried about a constraint on the freeway that you won't get to for a while. So don't use that estimate for how long it's going to take you to keep you from starting the drive. We'll go with that. We'll work on it. We'll polish it up.
That.
All right, let's see here. Brad says, would 3,000 assessors be an accurate number for assessing resources to keep the ecosystem running? Yeah, probably somewhere in the neighborhood. That might be a little high. 3,000 might be a little high. I don't know. We'll do the math. We'll sit down this week and maybe come up with a more accurate answer. This is something to ask on the town hall on Tuesday when the AB is talking about it. Do they have a number that they estimate for being the actual number of assessors? Okay, lots of training questions. What are risk mitigation efforts the department could take if there aren't enough assessors? I don't know. I don't think that the department is worried about there not being enough assessors, because if for no other reason, it takes less time to train new assessors than it does for companies to get ready for assessment, right? The path to assessor certification is much shorter. And when the demand spikes after the rule comes out, you're going to have all these people who are going to go through assessor training. You're going to have all these companies that want to be C3PAOs that are going to be hiring people. We're already seeing this happen with some of our friends at C3PAOs hiring like crazy because they already have a backlog of assessors. So I don't think that the department has a planned out public risk mitigation effort because I don't think that the problem of not enough assessors is going to be a problem by the time you get down to San Diego on the freeway. Let's see here. Okay, so Carr, long time person who interacts with our content on LinkedIn. Thanks so much. See you all the time. Always appreciate it. We see you out there. Carr says, oh, lost my screen. Carr says, I've heard you say the comments are often out of scope and don't change things. Do you think the comments is what caused the government to throw out 1.0, or was it something else? So this is in regards to public comments on rulemaking. And this is a very good point, because it is true. For instance, on the 48 CFR CMMC rule, this is the rule that is going to put CMMC certification level requirements into your contract clauses. A lot of times what we're seeing in the comments, which are ongoing right now, I think there's like 20 something days left in the comment period. A lot of times what we see is people are commenting on the 48 CFR contract clause rule about what about CUI marking? And what the government is saying is that's outside the scope of this rule, right? They're saying we're worried about the regulation that's crafting the language that's going into this contract clause, crafting the language for the contracting officers to tell them how and when to use this contract clause. It's related to CUI in the big picture, but the scope of this regulatory change doesn't have anything to do with the DoD's CUI program. It's actually a completely different office inside the DoD. And so as a result, these comments are out of scope of the rule. Commenting on CUI won't change anything about the 48 CFR rule. However, to Carr's point, circa 2020, when 4 years ago, this weekend, next weekend, when the rule came out, there was a massive amount of public comments on the rule, and they switched from the original plan. They took a year, reviewed the program, and then came up with this idea for CMMC 2.0. Now, I don't think that it was directly because of the content of the public comments that caused this to happen, because there were 750 public comments on the 2020 rule, but only about half of them were in scope. There was a lot of political outcry. There was a lot of industry backlash. There was a lot more back and forth in webinars, and there was just a lot more energy in the system and the conversation around CMMC than we have today. It's actually kind of hard to imagine, if you weren't there back in 2019 and 2020, how crazy the conversation and back and forth was. So I think that it wasn't necessarily because of the nature of the public comments as much as it was the totality of the conversation around CMMC at the time. So that's my take on it.
Can we jump to Mike's comment here that I see? How are primes reaching out to subs?
Yeah,
I was looking at in the other LinkedIn window about upvotes with thumbs up here. So this was a big one.
Oh, perfect.
How are primes reaching out to subs? We get the 7012 form letters from the ExoStar, requirements, generic letters. Would they reach out more personally regarding CMMC? Yes and no. And here's the reason why. The primes themselves have a supply chain management system. They're actually required to have one if they're in excess of $50 million from the DoD. So they, as part of the requirements, have to validate compliance with NIST 800-171 of their supply chain, which is where these cybersecurity questionnaires came out even to begin with. But the tricky part is, and Jacob, you and I have had this conversation, primes have wanted to collect as little information as possible for a very long time to mitigate their corporate risk, because if they actually knew how non-compliant their supply chain is, they would be held responsible for flowing work down to them. The reason that you haven't seen a massive outreach from the primes is they're still trying to legally figure out how much information they should acquire right now before the rule is published and have on their books, because that directly impacts their current contracts from a risk perspective of who they should continue to flow work down to. So I don't think primes are by any stretch going to walk out to you and say, hey, tell me about where you are with CMMC. Yeah. I think they're going to keep feeding you really generic forms until they're absolutely forced to make sure that their supply chain is compliant. And when that happens, which is basically when the rule's going to drop, it's already too late, because now a lot of their supply chain is going to start at zero or close to it and have to make this 12-month journey, right? Yeah.
Yeah, if they know the details of how non-compliant you are as their subcontractor, it's now their problem, right? If they have a piece of paper and a bunch of attestations from you that say we're good, we're planning to get certified, we're good, then when the CMMC rule hits the fan, if you will, then they can go, whoa, we've been asking you guys for months at this point, and you told us that you were fine. So when the DoD gets big mad about disruptions, they're going to go, what were we supposed to do? Right? This is the classic, if there's any attorneys listening, this is the classic trope of don't ask a question you don't already know the answer to, right?
Yeah.
And so if you start asking a lot of hard questions and you get a lot of details about this problem, it now becomes your problem. And that is not a problem that they want to deal with. We've seen this before. We love our friends at the primes, but it is easier to get DoD to give us hints about rulemaking when they're not legally allowed to than it is to get a prime representative on a stage to take questions about their plans around CMMC, because the lawyers at the primes are like, nope, you don't ask anything, you don't say anything, you don't do anything, because then it's our problem. So that's just the way that the world works here. But like we said before, if you have not heard from them about here's money, here's resources, here's all this stuff, then you're probably not going to. So you need to be proactive in reaching out in terms of what's going on. If you've been getting generic letters, generic questionnaires, all that stuff, call somebody, because they're probably not. Literally, I mean, we're a week or two away from the final rule being published, at which point the primes can say, okay, you told us that you were good to go.
Yep.
Let us know what number you pulled for your spot in line, and then we'll go from there. And if you come back and you tell them, well, we're not anywhere close, that's outside of what DoD is going to be concerned about, because that's between you and the prime here.
Yep.
Let's see. James had an interesting thought about 8A small businesses. If an SMB AA can get a FedRAMP authorization, I've seen multiple now. CMMC is absolutely doable and a no-brainer. It's very interesting.
That's incredible. If that's happened, that's great, James.
Absolutely. Let's see here.
Charles had an interesting question about asset scoping.
Let's see here. I see him.
Would be 10:36 your time.
Alrighty. Charles says, so outside of the Microsoft world, migration to a secure data enclave, not Microsoft, but FedRAMP moderate.
Okay.
Acronym warning, everybody. Acronym warning. Go for it, Daniel.
Okay. First off, we recently had a conversation with a company. Can we talk about Prevail for a second?
I mean, I'll put the link to our blog in here in case people want to know what's going on. So big drama around the FedRAMP moderate equivalency world these days.
So we talked to somebody this week that was part of a issue with Prevail no longer meeting FedRAMP moderate equivalency. I don't have, outside of the testimony of this person that I talked to, I have no evidence of that. So don't at me. But when people say equivalent, I will just say this. Equivalent, as everyone knows, according to the DoD memo, is exponentially harder than just going after FedRAMP authorization, assuming you can get sponsorship, right? Because you can't have poamable items on your equivalency. Just be very careful, because that can apparently slip very quickly and impact you in a really negative way. So anyways, we'll keep going with the question, but I wanted just to bring that up as a fair warning. Be very hesitant on equivalency, because it can falter in the middle of an assessment and cause you to fail. So
yeah, absolutely.
But
talk about sorry,
go ahead.
Keep going. No,
I was going to finish out the question here. So outside the Microsoft world, migration to a secure data enclave, not Microsoft, FedRAMP moderate equivalent, and or ATO, the client has non-FedRAMP SSO from cloud-based auth provider. Will the client be required to move the single sign-on to a FedRAMP certified version from the cloud auth provider from the CSP providing the SDE, or do we care? So to break this apart really quick, authentication for just regular employees is not CUI, like at all. Not an issue. So the FedRAMP thing historically has fallen out of scope of those applications needing to be FedRAMPed. However, our good friend security protection data that was introduced in the proposed rule has FedRAMP requirements for security protection data being log or configuration information about assets inside or supporting that enclave environment. And so that security protection data would very likely, I'll just go ahead and say, would ideally be in scope for a single sign-on authority like Duo. So we have to go Duo FedRAMP instead of just Duo Commercial, for example, to make sure that we're covered on that because of that transaction and because of that logging of that resource or that authentication mechanism. So if the proposed rule stays the way it is, and we'll know this shortly here in a week or two, if it is going to be the same, then yes, they would need to move that single sign-on identity source to a FedRAMP solution, assuming it's SaaS-based or cloud-based. Jacob, do you agree?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, navigating through the FedRAMP requirements, and this is something that people should be aware of. I mean, there's a lot of word on the street about the mythical FAR CUI rule.
Yeah.
And something to consider here is, I know I do this a lot where I'm like, well, back in the day, this is what DoD was thinking. And the rationale behind why they make decisions is very helpful to understand their policy position, right?
Yep.
So FedRAMP moderate equivalency is not a normal thing. This is something that the DoD came up with circa 2016 to try to make things easier on industry. Because back then, when they were revising DFARS 7012, FedRAMP was still relatively new, and there were very few FedRAMP authorizations. And if you weren't the government, you weren't working with anything FedRAMP, period. but companies are still putting the DoD's data in the cloud. And so they said, listen, we have the requirement for our data that when it goes in the cloud, it has to be FedRAMP. You're putting our data in the cloud and you can't get FedRAMP solutions. So what are we going to do? Their idea was, okay, when you do that, make sure that the solutions that you're using are at least equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. And they left it at that. I think that the days of FedRAMP moderate equivalency as it exists right now are numbered. We saw that with the FedRAMP moderate equivalency memo in January, where it basically is everything short of paying for an assessment to go through FedRAMP. We've heard that is going to be revised to be even more clear. So the path back towards FedRAMP is the path that we're on.
Yeah.
When it comes to the FAR CUI rule, which would be for any form of CUI for any federal contractor being put in the cloud, FedRAMP equivalency is not guaranteed to be the thing that rule talks about. I have a feeling that they're just going to say, if it's in the cloud and it's CUI, FedRAMP moderate. And so these questions around like what we're going to do with FedRAMP, people sometimes think that it's overkill whenever we're like, hey, we have to use the FedRAMP version of this, or we have to use the FedRAMP version of that. We are future-proofing what we're doing against the way that the policy winds are blowing. Because if you go back in time long enough, you can see that FedRAMP moderate equivalency was an anomaly, not the regulatory bedrock on which things will continue to evolve in the future with other rules outside of what DoD is doing. Alrighty, let's see here, man. Tons and tons of questions. So anything that we don't get to, Eddie with the jokes in here. Anything that we don't get to, we'll add to the queue to the start of next week. Next week, Scott Edwards will actually be joining us. So we'll be able to hopefully take on even more questions. There's some people in here with some suggestions on the math for total assessors. We will take a look at that. Let's see here. We're just over an hour. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Let's see. Could you see another class deviation being issued by the DoD to address the backlog of needed assessments? For example, could the DoD issue a class deviation that says that if an OSC is in the pipeline for an assessment with a C3 PAO, then the OSC will not be penalized for not meeting the effective date of CMMC? That is a very creative and forward-leaning idea of how to use mechanisms that the DoD has at its fingertips to make this process a lot smoother. That is a great idea. Could that happen? Sure. Will it happen? We don't know. I mean, we dodged a complete bullet with the class deviation that says everybody's going to be using 171 Rev 2 until further notice, because that would have been a massive train flying off the broken bridge into the canyon type of a situation. So maybe they could do something like that. I have heard no rumors of them issuing such a class deviation. I think that, like many things, they wouldn't consider that until it's already a problem. And so if that is the way that it's going to go, that's great. Your problem as a contractor is, will they come up with this solution before you get crushed by the problem? And for a lot of companies, if you end up getting caught up in the problem before the DoD comes up with a solution, most companies are so small they can't weather that storm. Besides the fact that this is the long-term way of approaching these issues going forward. So could that happen? Sure. Very creative idea.
Yeah.
I don't actually know who put this in here. We'll have to look.
Let's see.
But if you are a DoD employee, then please run that up the chain of command, because I think that's a great idea. All right, let's see here. So this is an opinion question here at the end from Jonathan, and I think this is probably a good one to end on. So Jonathan said, I've heard many people say the majority of companies aren't ready for CMMC and won't qualify for an assessment. Where is the data showing this is in fact true? I would say there are a lot of companies not prepared, but there are also companies who have leaned forward and are ready. I don't think it's fair to make that assumption, and only a company can determine if they are ready. Well, I'll put it to you this way. Maybe we'll start with you, Daniel. Why, in your experience, would you say that the majority of defense contractors aren't ready?
So right now, I'm talking to about 5 defense contractors a day. That's not uncommon for me to do. I've been doing this for close to 5 years. And there's more than just me doing this role here at our company. So let's say, conservatively, we've talked to 7,000 defense contractors. We have almost 1,000 clients. And I'm not saying that you have to come to Summit 7 to get compliant, But what I am saying is those people that I talked to that did not are now reaching back out to us. So what I'm saying is like, yes, you are absolutely right. There is no data. This is all gut. But I've talked to so many and where they are today, and the ones I talked to 5 years ago are in the same place they were 5 years ago.
Yep. Yep.
Like,
listen, the plural of anecdote is not data, right? That is an anecdotal thing, but you have talked to thousands of companies.
Thousands.
I would say, from my perspective, throw a dart at any one of the reports that have come out over the last several years from the DoD directly, from DIBCAC, from groups like MXD, or from private companies like Sarah Brin. And over and over and over again, we have seen the same numbers crop up. Only about 20-ish% of the contractors that are surveyed about this situation are anywhere close to being fully implemented with their requirements. And it's been the same number for years. So yes, it is true. Yeah. There are a group of several thousand companies that are forward-leaning, early adopters, know what's up, saw which way this was going, considered it an advantage, or whatever reason, and they decided to do it. That is not the majority of companies in the DIB. And I would say, I mean, let us know if you disagree in the comments. I understand the sentiment, but we have seen zero evidence to suggest that the majority of companies are in fact ready. It is actually consistently shown to be the opposite. One example, I was just at the Coalition for Government Procurement event where DoD had multiple speakers up on stage, and they said that at one point when they had DIBCAC assessors going around, I think it was maybe a year or two ago, at one point when they were sending their DIBCAC assessors around to evaluate companies, 90% of the contractors that they knocked on the door were not implemented, like not even close. And so this is part of the reason why I wish the DoD could talk more about the things that they're doing during rulemaking, because if the DoD comes out here and goes, 90% of the companies that we talk to haven't implemented the thing that we've been stamping our feet about for 4 years, then it makes stuff like CMMC look inevitable. So I don't think it's a stretch in our own experience, based off of the various reports that have come out, to say that the majority of companies are not in fact ready. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. We're not judging people. It's just the truth.
No. Yeah. Jonathan ended up commenting back, I definitely concur, just curious. I see it myself as well. So he's in our camp. So
yeah. I totally get it. But yeah, I definitely think that and maybe we'll highlight some of those in a show coming up in the future about some of these reports because they're definitely interesting reading. Yeah. All right. So there are some questions that came in about scoping. There's some questions that came in that were a little technical. We'll add those to the queue for the beginning of the show next week when Scott will be on here with us. We're just over an hour. Thanks everybody for our first simul stream on LinkedIn and YouTube. Thanks. I am around, the first YouTube commenter ever. If you have questions and you're watching this afterwards, you can put your comments in the LinkedIn chat or on YouTube, and we will get to them in the show in the future. And if you have suggestions for things you want us to talk about, then go from there. I'm sorry to all the Dolphins fans who were in the comments talking about your situation. Imagine, you want to do a quick history lesson. Imagine taking Tua in the draft over Justin Herbert. What a different timeline we might be on. Right, Dolphins fans? Anyways, that's it for the show this week. We'll see you next Friday morning, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. See y'all.